Welcome back, it's great to see so many of you. If you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button below, hit the bell to be notified. I'm going to be posting probably about 2 to 3 videos a week if I can. Mixture of tips, tricks, tutorials, God, that's a mouthful, and reviews and more discussive videos, a bit like this one, looking at some of the challenges of transitioning from DSLR to mirrorless, the challenges of moving from stills photography into video. So this video is really going to focus, as the title said, on one of the biggest decisions you have to make. Is 4K the right way to go? You buy perhaps your first mirrorless camera, you buy a camera that is more than capable, like these Nikon Z6 and Z7, of 4K video recording, and you assume that 4K is the way to go. You want to use every capability of the cameras that you've just invested in. It's understandable, and it's the approach that I took. I assumed that 4K was the right way to go. However, what I've learnt, that you have to challenge yourself, is 4K the right way to go? And make a conscious decision rather than just thinking, I'll use the capabilities I've got in the camera. As a consumer of YouTube, I do most of my viewing on the 4K monitor just next to me or a large TV screen. And therefore I'm perhaps consuming at 4K more than the average person. The average person on YouTube may be looking at content on a smaller screen or a mobile device, and therefore 1080p is more than adequate. So I've stepped back from 4K 1080p and really looked at the end-to-end process of video production. And that's what we're going to go through today, just to give you an insight and get you thinking about what are all the steps in creating a balanced production workflow. As we all know, quality in equals quality out, and therefore let's start at the beginning of that process and just thinking about what are you going to be recording. I'm obviously recording a lot of what I'm doing, a lot of my content in a studio environment where I have a certain amount of control over the light, over the audio. However, if you're going to be videoing out in the field, you have less control over that, and you need to think about how am I going to control the quality of the image that my camera is going to pick up. Photography and videography is really about the capture of light. That's what your camera is capturing on its sensor. It's the reflected light off of my face, off of the surroundings, that create colour, luminosity, and therefore the quality of the image that your camera can produce. And therefore, if you don't have an amount of control over that, you're not going to have the optimum image to start with in the process. And therefore that may be a consideration in 1080p, 720p versus 4K. Let's now look at the camera or whatever device you're using to capture the images. It's a complex series of interlocking components that need to be balanced really well, and that's the role of the designer. You've got the lens which feeds the light onto the sensor. The sensor then feeds that data into a buffer to smooth the flow of data into the processor, which then does some compression, some processing, and then outputs that to a memory card which has constraints of its own. There's a lot of trade-offs that need to be made in the design and production of modern day camera. The Z6, Z7 that I'm using has a full frame sensor that is capable of capturing 4K. However, there's a difference between the Z6 and the Z7, as many of you will know. Because of the size of the Z7's sensor, that 45 megapixel sensor, actually it's bigger than 4K, and therefore there are too many pixels, and therefore it uses pixel binning to get rid of some of the data, to lose some of that data, to bring it down to a 4K size. The Z6 sensor, on the other hand, is a 4K sensor, and there's no need for any of that pixel binning or loss of pixel data to get it to a 4K size. Therefore, there are some subtle differences between the two cameras. The data from the sensor then flows into a buffer. Now on the Z6 and Z7, it's come in for some slight criticism in the stills world that the buffer is slightly constraining in the workflow. Luckily, that isn't an issue in the video workflow. and the data flows through that buffer into the processor. Again, Nikon in the Z series cameras has got a processor in there, an XP processor, which is more than capable of converting, compressing that video input into the right format to be output to the card. There is a trade-off between battery life, processing power, and heat. So for example, my RX100 Mark V in 4K filming is constrained at about 4 to 5 minutes, not because of any processing issue, it's the build-up of heat, and the camera starts to overheat at that point, so you then have to wait for the camera to cool down. Luckily, with a body the size of a Z6 or Z7, the heat shielding and heat dispersion is quite good, and therefore that isn't an issue for most mirrorless cameras. So we've processed the image in the processor, and that's then fed down to the memory card. Now, whilst the Z series cameras have taken some flack for only having a single memory card slot, actually the choice of XQD card is really good, especially for 4K video, because it's capable of writing at up to 350 megabits per second, which is more than enough for both 4K and 1080p recordings. Interestingly, the Z series cameras are going to have a firmware update later in the year, which will allow them to take the CF Express cards. Now, not all CF Express cards are the same. There are going to be 3 varieties of CF Express. There's going to be the A, B and C. The B card is equivalent in form factor to the XQD card. Now, one of the big differences with these different cards is the number of pipelines you can have into the card to get data onto that card. The CF Express A cards will have 1 pipe going onto them and can do 1,000 megabits per second. The B, which is equivalent to the XQD, will have 2 pipelines feeding data onto the card, which will allow up to 2,000 megabits per second, so 5 to 6 times the speed of data flow of the XQD. And then the larger form factor, the C type card, will have 4 pipelines onto it. So you can see that for perhaps 8K video recording, for cinematic cameras, that will allow up to 4,000 megabits per second. So really more than capable and future-proofed. So probably the camera is the least important driver in your decision making of 4K versus 1080p, because most cameras have had the skill of the designer to create that balanced series of components that allow you to shoot either. The next step of the process is transferring the data from your memory card or your camera into your hard drive or SSD. Now for that we'll probably use either a card reader or a cable, or perhaps increasingly Wi-Fi, although that can be quite constraining, particularly if you're filming at 4K, so something to consider there. So we've imported our video clips into our hard disk drive or our SSD, and this is where you suddenly find one of the pros and cons of 1080p versus 4K. We talked earlier about 4K having 4 times the number of pixels to 1080p. That is obviously going to translate into larger files. What I find is that, not unsurprisingly, the files for 4K are about 4 times the size of the 1080p recordings. And the reality of that is that a 1080p recording at 24 frames per second creates a file of about 200 megabytes per minute of recording. The equivalent 4K file at 24 frames per second creates a file that's about 1 gigabyte of file space per minute of recording. So quite a considerable uplift there. So let's extrapolate that to perhaps a 10-minute recording for YouTube. So what does that mean in reality? Let's look at a 10-minute YouTube clip, like the one you're watching at the moment. I'm afraid very few of us are perfect. It takes many clips and my cutting room floor is totally littered with them. It takes, in general, about 2 to 3 times the length of clips to create the output. So in reality, a 4K 10-minute video for YouTube requires about 20, 25, 30 gigabits of storage space. A 1080p equivalent will be 5 to 6 gigabytes of storage. So as you can see, the size of hard drives, SSDs that you need for 4K is considerably larger than for 1080p. If you then consider you should be backing up your material, your content, you've got to think about backup as well. So we're not just talking about 20, 25, 30 gigabytes of storage. We're probably doubling that. It's also important to think about how you're going to process your footage. Are you going to use a laptop? Are you going to use a desktop? Is it a Mac or is it a Windows machine? But also thinking about, let's unpack that computer and think about, have we got the right amount of RAM? Is the processor capable enough? How many cores does the processor have? A video card with a GPU that is strong enough to process 4K versus 1080p. So it's important to consider, do you have a balanced computer that is capable of 4K versus 1080p? Other than probably more recent computers, it's unlikely that the computer at a base level would have been designed around 4K video production. Certainly many laptops are not capable of 4K production, and certainly not at a speed that would be acceptable to most of us. And therefore that could be one of the main constraining factors. If we then consider the software that you're using that sits on your computer, it's another important consideration. Those of you who are using Mac, I'm sure will be using Final Cut Pro because that's so well optimized for the Mac architecture, and that can in most cases easily produce 4K. If you're using a Windows computer of any kind, you're probably using something like Adobe Premiere Pro because that's more optimized for CUDA core NVIDIA cards and the Windows system. However, it's really important to consider, is the software optimized on your platform for 4K, or is it better suited to 1080p? This is really important when you come to render the video for whatever platform you're going to distribute it on. I'm going to look at YouTube because that's obviously where you're watching and what I'm producing for. If I render for 1080p, then the suggested settings for YouTube are producing 16 megabits per second content, which outputs at about 1.5 gigabytes per 10-minute recording. If I output and render for 4K, the suggested settings are 40 megabits per second, which outputs a file of about 4 gigabytes for a 10-minute recording. The rendering time using my computer obviously is going to vary depending on the processor power of your particular machine, but I find that rendering for 4K takes about 20 minutes, whereas rendering for 1080p is about half of that at 10 minutes. So if time is really important, then that's going to be a deciding factor in whether you render for 1080p or 4K. So when we stack all of this up, if we look at the file requirements for 4K, then we've got 20 to 25 gigabytes, let's say 25 gigabytes of original uncut material. We've backed that up, so that would take you up to 50 gigabytes. We've then produced a 4 or 5 gigabyte file for output to YouTube rendered, so that is going to take you up to between 50 and 60 gigabytes of storage you require for a 10-minute video. If we look at 1080p, then we said that the original content was about 5 to 6 gigabytes, so we're going to store that, we're going to back it up, so that takes you up to about 12 gigabytes, and the output was about 1.5 gigabytes, so we're talking 13-14 gigabytes of storage for 1080p versus 50 to 60 gigabytes for 4K. So we've created our polished 10-minute YouTube clip, we've rendered it in 1080p or 4K. The next step in the process is we've got to upload that to YouTube. I'm doing most of my uploading from a studio which has high-speed fibre broadband, and therefore uploading a 4K clip is less of a burden. It takes about 20 minutes still to upload to YouTube. However, if you're out in the field, 1080p may be the only option due to the constraints of internet connection. Uploading is obviously the first step in the process. YouTube then has to process it, and I find again at peak times YouTube can take probably 20 minutes to process a 4K 10-minute clip, and then even longer to render it from the base output of 360p up to the full selection of resolutions up to 4K. So again, if time is of the essence, then 1080p may be that better option versus 4K. Another trade-off in your decision-making process. So I hope that looking at the end-to-end workflow has helped you understand some of the trade-offs that go into that decision of 1080p versus 4K. It's not just a decision of my camera can do 4K, so therefore I'm going to do 4K. There are a lot of individual trade-offs in that decision-making process. Let's look at some of the pros and cons of 4K versus 1080p. As we've done, you need to think end-to-end. Is it actually a constraint around uploading? Is it a constraint around processing that could force you to think 1080p versus 4K? Or do you have that balanced workflow and balanced set of kit that underpins that workflow that allows you to do 4K in an almost seamless way? It's important to think about quality in equals quality out. If you don't have the ability to produce quality images into a quality lens, into a quality camera, and then follow that through the workflow, you may be better off accepting that at the moment 1080p is the right way to go. There is nothing wrong with 1080p quality. In fact, most audiences on YouTube will be viewing on a device which 1080p is more than adequate for. However, future-proofing is really important to consider. Will audiences be consuming content on devices we haven't even thought of today, where 4K is the baseline, where perhaps 1080p or 720p was the baseline today? If we want our content to be high in the rankings, perhaps 4K will be what's expected, and unless you have 4K content, it won't appear high in the rankings. That may be really important for you, and therefore that may be the trade-off that says, actually I'm going to produce content today that is going to last into the future, and therefore 4K is really important. There is no right and wrong answer to this. It depends very much on your particular context, your particular situation, and 1080p is a pretty good output level. I'm producing at 4K and I'm going to continue producing at 4K, certainly for the short to medium term, because I'm looking to the future, and therefore it's not something I can go back and recreate later if I want to. And I have a workflow that actually can sustain 4K. There are some niggles in that, there are some pinch points. I hope you found this end-to-end look at workflow in the context of the decision of 1080p versus 4K really useful. Maybe if you're producing content or you're consuming content, what do you think on the matter? Should we be producing 1080p or should we be increasingly producing 4K? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't subscribed, hit that subscribe button, hit the bell, and you'll be notified of future videos. Hope you found this useful and look forward to seeing you on future videos.